Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, March 23rd. Last night, Keir Starmer spoke once again to Donald Trump as the Iran crisis deepens. But this time, the call came a matter of hours after the US president posted on social media a TV sketch from the inaugural edition of Saturday Night Live UK with a fake Keir Starmer having a meltdown as the president is trying to call him and fretting about what to say. In real life, we are told that last night's call between the real Keir Starmer and the real Donald Trump was constructive. My name is really Anne McElvoy of Politico.
And I'm actually Sam Coates of Sky News. Truly, it was all postmodernism in action. The sketch opened with the phone ringing and a fake Keir Starmer saying in a nervy voice, "What if Donald shouts at me?" You've got to imagine the sketch came up in the call, Anne, and you can see why Number 10 would have been very, very keen to have that conversation last night, just to convince people that art and real life aren't quite the same thing. Just a reminder that Donald Trump has not relented on his public criticism in recent days of the UK Prime Minister, not least in that Truth Social posting, but also saying that even after the UK allowed the US to use Diego Garcia for defensive operations, that London should have acted a lot faster.
That's pretty much the only bit of levity, the sketch in the bleakest moment yet in this conflict. Donald Trump's 2-day deadline to Iran to reopen the Straits of Hormuz expires at 7:30 East Coast time tonight. That's 11:30 in the evening in the UK. The US president said the Islamic Republic must fully open without threat the vital waterway or see its energy plants bombed, starting with the biggest.
So you can see the escalation, and Iran responded with a statement from its army command to that, saying that if the power facilities are attacked, as Donald Trump suggests, it would close the Straits of Hormuz completely. Look, the rhetoric suggests neither side is willing to back down, despite Donald Trump on Friday suggesting we might be at the end game of this conflict. And it does seem like the war has already triggered an unprecedented oil and gas supply crisis, now seemingly without a clear endgame.
As we started recording this morning, oil was slightly down from its recent high at $112 a barrel. But really, the global and domestic impact is yet to hit, and that is going to be the big focus today. Keir Starmer will gather his key cabinet colleagues, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, together to work out the next steps to protect the UK economically with an emergency COBR committee. We will then hear from the Prime Minister for a full 90 minutes at 2:30 when he appears in front of MPs at the liaison committee. So that will be box office.
Yeah, there are major, major challenges on the economic dashboard right now. I actually spent some of the weekend talking to business groups about this. You'll notice that there's a discussion at the moment around contingency planning, and nobody wants to talk about things like disruption to the supply of petrol, for instance. And what's interesting once you dug down with various people is part of that is just simply psychological. There's a real fear, I think, around the place that if people start to talk about shortages, then everyone with half full tanks goes and fills them. And that from the past is what has caused the problem, which is why you're hearing this very conservative message on the airwaves about contingency planning. But in private, business groups worry that disruption could be coming. The thing is that their members are all saying there are just more pressing issues because of the price rises. You know, those include the cost of fuel for hauliers, shipping prices going up markedly, energy bills for small businesses that aren't protected by the price cap, and so on. So there is this COBRA today, and tomorrow there's a meeting between Rachel Reeves and investment banks. But as everyone deals with the short term, the price rises, and the medium term, which could be disruption, I want to highlight something that just feels bigger than all of that put together because of the long-term probable impact on the economy. And that's the implications of the UK cost of borrowing, right? This is a story from Friday that we can't get away from. It turns out that the 10-year government bond closed at 4.94%, right? Just to put that in context, that's higher than the cost of borrowing, UK government borrowing got to after the mini budget, higher than any point this decade. And in fact, you have to go back to 2008 and the financial crisis before you find anything comparable. It's dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. And it's really hard to overstate it, not just politically, but for the whole nation. I mean, all nations are seeing a bit of this, but that doesn't mean it's any less painful here. Right, what does that mean? It means Rachel Reeves is about in all likelihood to get a lot less money to spend. Her headroom against fiscal rules is about to be eroded. It means that that will be something you have to factor in also, as we now get the potential for potentially a couple of increases in interest rates as well, which will make people feel poorer at the same time. So just as ministers here, like they will do at this COBRA meeting, demands for additional help with the cost of living and the help for businesses in order to keep down inflation, the reality is that Chancellor's about to have even less resource to pay for it all, which is why I think a lot of the rhetoric will focus on stopping private companies profiteering rather than help. And nobody in that COBRA meeting will know the absolutely most essential cornerstone question of all, which is how long is this all going to go on for? That's the big picture economically, and I think that borrowing costs for me are the bleakest medium to long term element of it. But what's the big picture of what they're having to deal with all of that?
So I think what you're laying out there, and the threat of this being a really worst case scenario for the UK economy, depends a lot on how long this goes on. I mean, it's dreadful anyway, as you point out, to be seeing those kind of those sort of surges that you described in government bonds, and every indicator there tells you that there's going to be a problem for Rachel Reeves to deal with. Of course, if she doesn't really know whether she's dealing with something that can last weeks, months, etc., it gets harder. And I think that underscores something else that we're going to be talking about today, which is Britain's expanding role in the conflict. Now, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, will be given a statement today in his usual keep calm, Captain Mannering manner on the crisis. And I think he will really be trying to pass lightly over the fact that there's been quite a big shift in position to allow Donald Trump's bombers, US bombers, to use British bases to strike Iranian missile sites targeting shipping in Hormuz, rather than just the silos striking our Gulf allies. It must be, at least a full week since we sat on this podcast or something when that was the message. Do you remember that was being pumped out there? This is all about supporting our Gulf allies who have not launched attacks. It's not their fault. They've just got dragged in. Now, this is actually a rather different use case. And we had ministers out and about yesterday still saying this is defensive. I think you can almost feel it. In fact, Cooperfish can't go out public without making that case. But the line, as someone who follows this from the American side said to me, look, this is really getting towards a semantics difference when bases are being used for US B-2 bombers, and particularly if the conflict worsens, deepens and widens, as Donald Trump seemed to be suggesting if he didn't get the straits reopened tonight. Indeed, the Iranian foreign minister, who we learned yesterday, he was educated in Canterbury, Kent University, lived at the Kent seaside for a while. Obviously, the soft power didn't work there, because he's now accusing Britain of support for US aggression. And I think the attempted missile attack on Chagos pretty much supports the view that Tehran does not make much of a distinction as this war goes on. That was just something that struck me.
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? And because you've got Iran talking about allowing ships through the Straits of Hormuz, so long as that they're not enemy or hostile ships. But I don't think that they take the British government distinction of offensive versus defensive action when judging who that should be, do they?
Not at all. And I think that also is going to fray more if this goes into the next spiral of hostilities. Just to throw in, just to do a bit of a quick name drop on the podcast, I was talking, as you do, for a Politico podcast with Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and I was struck. He's a real rules-based order guy. This is really what he's made his second term about, and he's sort of fallen out with Donald Trump over that and much else. But it was interesting to me that he was trying to suggest that there could be some form of off-ramp in which the US lent heavily on Israel. He thought this basically that the strategy and tactics of the war were being driven by Israel, and that if the US could get a win, or get something it could call a win, that would sort of could maybe be good enough at least to get to a ceasefire. And that's very much, I think, what Yvette Cooper has been echoing as well. That none of this helps until you can really get to a point where both sides can see a moment. Now, is there anything that is yet what Donald Trump can tell himself and tell his supporters is a win on the war in Iran? Well, I think that's a much more difficult question. But I mean, that was the only way Mr. Guterres saw this coming to anything like a swift end.
I think that's right. And you talk about the pressure rising and the questions around international law. The Attorney General is going to wade in on exactly this really complex, thorny issue this afternoon. Richard Hermit is out and about. We've said it before, we'll say it again. He's possibly the most important Attorney General of our lifetimes. Love him or hate him, and he's quite a figure that divides the House of Commons. But he's important because of his closeness to Keir Starmer, his influence on this government. And also, this is a weird one, but he's doing a very good job of telling us and telling the world what he's up to, which is actually quite refreshing. Normally AGs work in private, but it's good to hear a bit more about how they're going about it, even if some of what they say is contested. So he's doing a lecture at Manchester University this afternoon, which is politically, actually, it's a challenge to the Tories and Reform and anyone else who's sort of saying, look, in this era of Trump and Putin, you can't take the letter of international law too seriously. He's going to push back at that and say that it's essential, it delivers security, it delivers human rights for everybody, it delivers protections for working people. And essentially, he's going to say that, therefore, it's the key to peace, trade, and continued work in NATO. And if you go down the Reform and the Tory route, all you're doing, he says, is to outsource foreign policy to bigger countries. So that's the sort of nature of his riposte. Do you think that'll work, Anne?
Well, it's interesting that he's going quite so frontal on it, particularly given that some of our key allies, notably Friedrich Merz, Chancellor in Germany, at the very beginning of the war, gave a bit of permission to Donald Trump, in his eyes, on this, saying there was not much point in citing international law if nobody was abiding by it. In essence, kind of get real, we're way past that. Ursula von der Leyen said something a bit along the same lines as she nuanced it, but quite a lot of European doubts about whether the old rules-based system is now fit for purpose. So that is genuinely interesting to me to hear how Lord Hermit will phrase that. I mean, he's clearly looking at the domestic compact, isn't he, and where he can differentiate Labour from Reform and from the far left. The challenge would be the war was unfolding without any path through the structures of a rules-based approach. So we haven't had a Security Council resolution, etc. There is, I think, a challenge to his position, and I think it is also held in some parts of the British government as well, which is that what matters more is defensive alliances, and that's really the path that we're on here, rather than trying to restore the frayed rules-based order in the institutions that held it together. And if you look at Ukraine, we're really focusing a lot more on the fallout from the war and the security of Eastern and Central Europe and Ukraine than we are about which particular institutions Ukraine should be in. I mean, those stories run, but it seems to me it's been driven really by the security argument. And that's interesting when you look at what's happened in Chagos and the attempt by Iran to had a sort of trial of two of its major intercontinental ballistic missiles going for Chagos. The Times got really good briefing on the ins and outs of that today, and two things that stuck in my mind. One is it's a very useful practice run for Iran to get information about how its missiles perform. So yes, the UK does have a strong missile shield. There's an attempt, I think, to the MOD and ministers to calm down people fretting about that. And would these missiles reach the UK anyway? Probably not, although probably is doing quite a lot of work in that sentence. It would be shot down on the way. But this whole capacity comes under NATO, under something called the Integrated Air and Missile Defence, the IAMD. Snappy little acronym there. And that is, if you scrape around the back end of the defence reviews and the work that goes into them, you will find quite a lot of concern about deficiencies there in an area where we need to step up faster. I'm not saying that there's a tension between Lord Hermit talking about rules-based order but forget all that and just go and do more NATO. But in a sense, there is something in it, because you do need to decide, really, is your response to this to talk more about the order that you want back, or is it to say, do you know what, let's get on and do whatever our equivalent of sort of Iron Dome for Israel is, and if it won't be literally that, but make sure that, we've covered our defences, and you go down a more security view of what the UK needs more?
Where I think that Lord Hermer and some of your sources would completely agree is on the need for robust ability for the UK to defend itself. But that, of course, is a big, big challenge. On Thursday's podcast last week, we revealed that the Treasury had been thinking about further raids to the international development budget in order to put more cash into the MOD. But at the very last minute, after a revolt by Labour MPs, that was curbed. And I saw that story floating again over the weekend. Hermer thinks that the two are pretty much intertwined: a rules-based order adherence and a strong military budget. The question is, where is it going to come from? Ultimately, the question is there money, and is the money that has been allocated being spent sensibly? And that's where, yes, there's blame at the Treasury, but there's also blame in military circles as well. But none of that looks like it's going to be fixed soon. And the challenges that this conflict has posed with the increased use of drones and therefore a different type of capacity being tested to what we saw in Ukraine, just being really, really tough.
And as any cabinet minister trying to protect their favourite projects from being raided, money really is already in short supply, and the piggy bank is looking even emptier, I think, as we go forward this year.
That's an ideal segue just to allow us to update you on a handful of things that are essential knowledge for today, as we like to do on this podcast. The first is a headache for Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood. The deal to fund French beach patrols is about to run out. It's 3-year its 3-year term is almost up. £475 million deal expires at the end of the month. It's always been contested as to how successful it's been. But if the latest round of talks ended without agreement last Thursday, then in a matter of days, it could be all over. She's said to be pushing for a new package, but it could include more money, but would also come with more performance-related clauses to make funding dependent on the proportion of boats intercepted by the French, according to the Times.
I'm now trying to imagine the performance review that will be going into that one. Second headache for the Home Secretary. She's the subject of anger from Hillsborough law campaigners who are accusing her of being personally behind the delay to this overdue legislation. That's a BBC story. The bill will not be passed by the end of this Parliament, despite Keir Starmer's promise to have it in place by the 36th anniversary of the disaster when he addressed that just under a year ago. Now, the hold-up centres on how the clause of duty of candour for public officials, if something has gone wrong, how would that apply to the intelligence services? And I do know that this is because there's a lot of tension, especially with MI5, but other services too, saying that this blanket term of the descriptions of saying that people working in official posts would be effectively forced into a duty of candour legally, that there wasn't enough protection put into that for those working for or with the intelligence services, and effectively also for basically for moles and people who supply them with the information and who need to have that relationship of trust that they won't be outed. And there's been a lot of controversy when that has come close to happening recently in a number of cases. So I understand that the intelligence services bosses have been talking to Lord Hermer, it's that man again, to try to iron this out and to draw a distinction. But it is annoying, of course, for campaigners and for MPs who thought, as the Prime Minister had made this the centrepiece of his launch speech at Labour conference, that they thought this was nailed on.
Yeah, just once again, that old theme of Keir Starmer barreling into something without having seen through all the elements of the detail and then coming a bit of a cropper. And by the way, it's not just a problem for the Home Secretary. I hear that the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary are also kind of blocking this at the moment. But it's interesting to me politically that the people briefing this want to target Shabana Mahmood rather than the other two. I think there's something going on wider than just what's about Hillsborough there. Final thing for today, I know we're squeezing it into the last minute/minus minute, but it's quite important. It's the spillover from Tory Shadow Justice Secretary Nick Timothy's article last week that the mass ritual prayer by members of the Muslim faith in Trafalgar Square, including Sadiq Khan, who was in the video, was an act of domination that shouldn't have happened and shouldn't happen again. Now, to remind you, after PMQs, Kemi Badenoch doubled down. But I'm really picking up some angst in corners of the Conservative Party. It was interesting to hear shadow cabinet members being forced to try and double down. But yesterday, like you should have heard James Cleverly, the shadow community secretary, he defended Nick Timothy on free speech grounds, and he tried to make an argument on segregation grounds, although that wasn't part of Nick Timothy's original case. But then he was asked very bluntly by Laura Kuenssberg, do you agree with Nick Timothy that the event was an act of personal domination or political? But then he was asked very bluntly by Laura Kuenssberg, do you agree with Nick Timothy that this was an act of domination? And James Cleverly replied, that wouldn't be my take on it. And he then tried to pivot to an attack on the Labour Party. But look, that is shadow cabinet division over something that I think is one of the most testing issues that Kemi Badenoch has gone very, very hard on. And I know that in parts of the grassroots, there's real upset about this, and parts of the Tory parliamentary party. So let's see how that goes. It was interesting to watch the shadow cabinet jumping around about how they justified this, having to go beyond what Nick Timothy originally and initially said. And I felt that the process of Kemi Badenoch adopting it without having fully thought through what she was doing and sorting out arguments that could keep everybody on side was quite instructive about a weakness in her manner of her leadership.
It sounds like it's not the last time that this subject is going to rear its head, and particularly that use of the language around submission and who is happy to submit. And that is, my bat ear is picking up a lot of the discourse on the right in continental Europe that uses this language. Interesting and perhaps a bit disturbing to see it coming into the UK as a casus belli. So I think it's good to know that.
Right, that's it. Monday morning's Politics at Sam and Anne's has burst over it's overhanging its belt, and so we ought to sorry for the horrible metaphor. So let's shut up, and we will see you tomorrow.
I have nothing more to say on the matter.